The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when they found the box. It wasn't supposed to be there, buried beneath the floorboards of the old Henderson house on Maple Street, a Victorian relic scheduled for demolition that Tuesday morning in March 2024. The construction crew had already torn through the front porch, exposing rotted wood and the skeletons of forgotten summers, when Miguel Santos's crowbar hit something that didn't sound like timber, something hollow, something that rang with the metallic echo of secrets kept too long. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, were photographs. Dozens of them. A young woman with dark hair and a cautious smile, captured in moments that seemed stolen rather than shared. Behind her in several shots, barely visible in the background, was a figure blurred, watching. And beneath the photographs, folded with the kind of care that suggested ceremony, was a letter written in precise handwriting on stationery from the Riverside Motel, dated August 14, 1999. "I'm sorry for what I have to do," it began. But she won't stop asking questions. Miguel dropped the letter as though it had burned him. His hands were shaking when he called the police, and his voice cracked when he tried to explain what he'd found. Within an hour, Riverside, Indiana, a town of 8,000 souls tucked between cornfields and the winding Tippecanoe River, was about to be forced to remember what it had spent 25 years trying to forget. The name on those photographs was Sarah Mitchell. She had been 19 years old when she disappeared on August 15, 1999, walking home from her shift at the corner diner. Her car had been found abandoned on County Road 9, keys still in the ignition, driver's side door hanging open like a question that had never been answered. For months, the town had searched. Volunteers combed the woods. Divers explored the river. Her mother, Patricia, had stood on the courthouse steps every Sunday for 2 years, holding a framed photograph and asking anyone who would listen if they had seen her daughter. But Sarah Mitchell had simply vanished, as though the humid August night had swallowed her whole. Eventually, the searches stopped. The posters faded in shop windows. Patricia moved away in 2003, unable to bear the weight of unanswered prayers. The case went cold, filed away in a box in the basement of the Riverside Police Department, where Detective Frank Morrison had kept it company for years, pulling it out on slow nights and staring at Sarah's school photograph as though sheer force of will could conjure answers from the silence. Now, 25 years later, those answers were emerging from beneath the floorboards of a house that belonged to someone everyone in Riverside knew. The Henderson house had been built in 1887 by Chester Henderson, one of the town's founding families. For generations, it had stood as a monument to old money and older secrets. A towering structure with gabled windows and a wraparound porch where the Henderson family had hosted summer socials that defined Riverside's social hierarchy. But by the 1990s, the house had fallen into disrepair, its last occupant a recluse who let the garden grow wild and the paint peel away like skin. That last occupant had been Evelyn Jackson. Evelyn had lived in the Henderson house from 1997 to 2001, renting the property from the Henderson estate after the last of the family line died without heirs. She had been 32 years old then, a schoolteacher at Riverside Elementary who taught 4th grade and stayed late to tutor struggling students. Everyone knew Miss Jackson. She had soft eyes and a patient voice, and she kept a jar of butterscotch candies on her desk that she handed out to children who needed encouragement. She wore cardigans even in summer and carried worn copies of poetry books in her bag. Mary Oliver, Pablo Neruda, Rumi. She had been kind. Everyone said so. But on that rainy March morning in 2024, when Detective Sarah Chun, Frank Morrison's successor, appointed after his retirement in 2019, stood in the ruins of the Henderson house and read that letter, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because the handwriting matched samples they had on file from 1999. Samples taken during the initial investigation from everyone Sarah Mitchell had known. The handwriting belonged to Evelyn Jackson. By noon, the news had spread through Riverside like floodwater. By 3 p.m., news vans from Indianapolis and Lafayette were parked outside the police station. By evening, Evelyn Jackson's name was trending on social media, accompanied by her old faculty photograph from the Riverside Elementary yearbook, a woman with gentle features and graying hair, smiling slightly, as though she knew something the camera couldn't capture. Detective Chun sat in her office that night, rain still drumming against the windows, and stared at the evidence spread across her desk. The box, the photographs, the letter, and beneath it all, a question that had haunted Frank Morrison for a quarter-century. What happened to Sarah Mitchell? Now, they had a suspect, but Evelyn Jackson had left Riverside in 2001, citing health reasons and a desire to be closer to family. She had moved to Oregon, according to the forwarding address she'd left at the post office. After that, the trail went cold. Detective Chun picked up the phone and made the call she had been dreading. Within 24 hours, an arrest warrant was issued. Within 48, a team from the Oregon State Police located Evelyn Jackson living in a small cottage outside Portland, working as a librarian, tending a garden full of roses. When they came to her door, she didn't run. She didn't protest. She simply looked at the officers with those same soft eyes everyone in Riverside remembered and said, "I've been waiting for you." The words sent a chill through every officer present. The extradition took a week. When Evelyn Jackson arrived back in Riverside, escorted by 2 federal marshals and Detective Chun herself, the town stood silent. People lined the streets as the transport van passed, not cheering or jeering, but simply watching with faces that couldn't reconcile the woman in handcuffs with the teacher who had once comforted their children after scraped knees and hurt feelings. At the police station, Evelyn was processed with quiet efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, the reading of rights. She answered every question with the same calm demeanor, her voice steady and low. Yes, she understood. Yes, she would cooperate. No, she didn't need a lawyer yet. Detective Chun sat across from her in interview room 2, a cramped space with fluorescent lights and walls the color of old coffee. Between them was a manila folder containing 25 years of questions. "Tell me about Sarah Mitchell," Chun said. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. Her fingers were weathered now, marked by decades of garden work and turning pages. But her eyes were the same, soft, patient, impossibly sad. "She was looking for the truth," Evelyn said quietly, "and I couldn't let her find it." To understand what Evelyn Jackson had become, you had to understand what she had been. She was born in November 1965 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the second of 3 daughters to Robert and Catherine Jackson. Her father worked at the General Electric plant, assembling refrigerator motors with hands that smelled perpetually of machine oil and ambition. Her mother taught piano lessons from their living room, filling the house with the stumbling melodies of children learning Für Elise and the more confident renditions of adults rediscovering childhood dreams. Evelyn had been the quiet one. Her older sister, Margaret, had inherited their father's pragmatism and became a nurse. Her younger sister, Anne, had their mother's artistic temperament and moved to Chicago to paint. But Evelyn existed somewhere in between. Observant, thoughtful, the kind of child who spent hours in the backyard watching ants build their colonies, fascinated by the invisible architecture of purpose. She read voraciously. By age 12, she had consumed every book in the children's section of the Fort Wayne Public Library and began working her way through the adult fiction shelves. She loved stories about people who didn't fit, outcasts, wanderers, those who saw the world differently and paid the price for their vision. She underlined passages in her books, filling the margins with questions and observations written in her careful script. When she was 16, something happened that her sisters never talked about. It was 1981, and Evelyn had been walking home from her part-time job at the Woolworths when a man in a blue sedan pulled alongside her and offered her a ride. She had declined politely. He had insisted, growing aggressive, and when she tried to walk faster, he had gotten out of the car. She never told her parents exactly what happened next, only that she had run, cutting through yards and alleys until she reached Mrs. Henderson's house. Old Mrs. Henderson, who lived on the good side of town and kept her porch light on until midnight. Mrs. Henderson had called the police, made Evelyn tea, and sat with her until her parents arrived. The man was never caught, but something in Evelyn changed that night. She became more cautious, more watchful. She started carrying a small knife in her purse, and she never walked anywhere alone after dark. Her mother wanted her to see a counselor. Her father wanted to teach her to shoot. Evelyn did neither. Instead, she channeled everything into her studies, graduating valedictorian and earning a scholarship to Indiana University. She studied education, specializing in child psychology. Her professors remembered her as brilliant but reserved, the kind of student who asked penetrating questions but rarely offered personal opinions. She wrote her senior thesis on how children process trauma, specifically focusing on what happens when adults fail to protect them. It was dense, meticulously researched, and deeply personal in ways she never acknowledged. After graduation in 1987, she moved to Riverside. It was a deliberate choice, small enough to feel safe, big enough to need teachers. She started at Riverside Elementary that fall, teaching 4th grade in room 12, a sun-filled classroom overlooking the playground. She decorated it with quotes from her favorite books and kept plants on every windowsill, ferns and spider plants that she talked to when she thought no one was listening. Her students adored her. She had infinite patience for those who struggled and celebrated small victories with the same enthusiasm others reserved for major achievements. She learned all their names by the second day of school, along with their siblings' names, their pets' names, their favorite colors. She remembered birthdays and brought in homemade cupcakes. She stayed after school to help anyone who needed it, never making them feel like a burden. But there was something else about Miss Jackson that the children couldn't quite articulate, a sadness that lived behind her kindness. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her smile would fade and her eyes would drift to the window, staring at something only she could see. The children noticed but didn't understand. The other teachers noticed and attributed it to the loneliness of being single in a small town where everyone seemed to come in pairs. In 1997, when the Henderson house became available for rent, Evelyn jumped at the opportunity. It was more house than she needed: 3 bedrooms, high ceilings, a dining room that could seat 12. But she loved its history, its bones, the way light filtered through the old glass windows in patterns that changed with the seasons. She moved in that July with only her books, her plants, and furniture collected from garage sales and thrift stores. She made the house her sanctuary. She painted the walls in soft colors, cream and sage and the palest blue. She hung curtains she'd sewn herself. She planted a garden in the backyard, coaxing tomatoes and zucchini from soil that hadn't been tended in years. On weekends, she could be found at the Riverside Farmers Market, buying fresh eggs and honey, chatting with vendors who appreciated her quiet enthusiasm for their products. She attended the Methodist church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew and leaving before the social hour. She volunteered at the library on Tuesday evenings, helping people navigate the card catalog and recommending books based on instinct that was almost always right. She joined the Riverside Garden Club and shared cuttings from her roses with anyone who asked. She was woven into the fabric of the town, a fixture as reliable as the courthouse clock and the Friday night football games. People waved when they saw her car, a sensible Honda Civic she kept meticulously clean. Children shouted her name at the grocery store, and she always stopped to ask about their summers or their new siblings or their soccer teams. But at night, alone in the Henderson house, Evelyn Jackson was someone else. She kept a journal, hidden in the back of her closet behind winter coats she rarely needed in Indiana's mild climate. The entries were sporadic, written in the same careful handwriting as the letter found beneath the floorboards. But the tone was different, rawer, more desperate. She wrote about fear, about hypervigilance, about the exhaustion of always watching, always calculating exits, always aware of every man's proximity and intentions. She wrote about the girl she had been at 16 and the woman she'd had to become. She wrote about anger, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, deep anger that settles in bones and hardens into something like purpose. She wrote about justice and its failures, about systems designed to protect that too often didn't, about voices that spoke truth but weren't heard because the wrong people were listening. And she wrote about Sarah Mitchell. They met in the summer of 1999. Sarah had just finished her freshman year at Purdue and returned to Riverside for the summer, picking up shifts at the corner diner to earn money for textbooks. She was studying criminal justice, driven by a cousin's assault 3 years earlier and the subsequent trial that had ended in acquittal despite overwhelming evidence. Sarah was passionate, angry in the productive way of young people who still believe they can fix the world's brokenness through sheer determination. Evelyn met her at the diner one Tuesday morning in June. Sarah had been her server, efficient, friendly, asking if Evelyn wanted more coffee before her cup was half empty. They'd struck up a conversation about books. Sarah noticed the Mary Oliver collection Evelyn was reading and mentioned she'd just finished Wild Geese for an English elective. Evelyn quoted her favorite lines, and Sarah's face lit up with recognition and connection. After that, they kept running into each other. At the library, at the farmer's market, at the Memorial Day parade where they both stood in the back, observing rather than participating. Their conversations grew longer, deeper. Sarah talked about her studies, about her dream of becoming a prosecutor, about her determination to fix a broken system from the inside. Evelyn listened, offered books from her personal collection, shared her own experiences in carefully edited versions that revealed nothing too specific. Sarah started stopping by the Henderson house on her way home from shifts, and they would sit on the porch drinking iced tea and talking until the fireflies emerged. Evelyn found herself looking forward to these visits, to Sarah's energy and conviction, to the way she made the world seem fixable despite all evidence to the contrary. But then Sarah started asking questions. It began innocuously enough. Sarah mentioned she was thinking about doing an internship with the Riverside Police Department the following summer. She wanted to learn about investigations, about how cases were built. Detective Morrison had mentioned he had several cold cases that needed fresh eyes, and Sarah was eager to help. One case in particular interested her, a disappearance from 10 years earlier, 1989, of a young woman named Jennifer Pratt. Jennifer had been 23, a bank teller who vanished after leaving work one evening. Her car was found near the river, but her body never was. The case had gone cold within 6 months, filed away and forgotten by everyone except Jennifer's mother, who still called the police station every year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. Sarah had read about it in the old newspaper archives at the library. Something about it bothered her, not just the tragedy of it, but details that didn't add up. Jennifer's car had been found with a flat tire, but the tire had been slashed, not blown. There were muddy footprints on the passenger side that didn't match Jennifer's shoes, and in the final weeks before she disappeared, Jennifer had confided to friends that someone at the bank was making her uncomfortable, watching her, asking personal questions that felt invasive. But the police had never followed up on that lead. The person Jennifer had mentioned was a pillar of the community, well-respected, above suspicion. The investigation had focused instead on Jennifer's boyfriend, on transients passing through town, on theories that Jennifer had run away from small-town life. Eventually, it faded into the category of unsolvable mysteries that small towns collect like dust. Sarah wanted to reopen it. She talked to Evelyn about it one evening in late July, her face animated with purpose and fury. She talked about victim blaming and bias and how investigations often stopped at the borders of respectability. She talked about justice and truth and her absolute conviction that someone in Riverside knew what had happened to Jennifer Pratt. Evelyn listened with growing dread, because Evelyn knew what had happened to Jennifer Pratt. She had lived in Riverside then, had known Jennifer from the bank where everyone cashed their paychecks. She had watched the investigation unfold, had seen how quickly it abandoned certain lines of inquiry, had understood with sickening clarity why Jennifer's concerns about her colleague had been dismissed. Because the colleague in question was Thomas Henderson, the last of the Henderson family, the man who owned the house Evelyn now rented. Thomas Henderson had died in 1996 of a heart attack, 3 years before Evelyn moved into his family's home. He had never been charged with anything, never officially suspected. But Evelyn had known. She had recognized the signs. The way Jennifer had flinched when his name was mentioned. The way she'd changed her schedule to avoid certain shifts. The fear that lived in her eyes during the final weeks of her life. Evelyn had said nothing. She had been in Riverside for 2 years then, still building her life, still learning to feel safe in her own skin. She had told herself it wasn't her place to speculate, that she had no proof, that speaking up would only cause trouble for everyone involved. And then Jennifer had disappeared, and Evelyn had carried the weight of her silence ever since. Now Sarah was digging into that case, and she was smart enough and determined enough to eventually connect the dots Evelyn had seen years ago. And once she started pulling that thread, other things would unravel. Other cases, other disappearances and assaults that Riverside had collectively decided to forget because remembering required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about men everyone had respected. Evelyn tried to discourage her gently. She suggested Sarah focus on more recent cases, ones where evidence might still be fresh. She talked about the toll cold cases could take on young idealists. But Sarah was undeterred. She had that quality of youth that mistakes stubbornness for virtue, and she couldn't understand why Miss Jackson, kind, supportive Miss Jackson who always encouraged her students to ask questions, suddenly seemed to want her to stop asking them. Their relationship changed after that. The easy conversations became strained. Sarah sensed Evelyn's reluctance and mistook it for apathy, even betrayal. How could someone who'd taught her to think critically now want her to stop investigating? How could someone who'd survived trauma, Sarah had guessed, from things Evelyn hadn't said, now want her to let injustice slide? In early August, Sarah showed up at the Henderson house with a box of photocopied police reports and newspaper clippings. She spread them across Evelyn's dining room table. Jennifer Pratt, yes, but also 3 other cases from the 1980s and 90s. All women, all unsolved, all connected by threads so thin the police had never seen them, but Sarah had. She had mapped them, cross-referenced them, built a theory that someone in Riverside had been hurting women for decades and getting away with it because he was protected by respectability and collective denial. It was Thomas Henderson, Sarah said, her voice shaking with conviction. I know it was. He had access, opportunity, and a pattern of behavior that everyone ignored because his family built half this town. And I think people knew. I think they looked the other way. Evelyn stood in her kitchen, hands gripping the counter, and felt the floor fall away beneath her feet. Because Sarah was right. And if Sarah kept digging, she would find not just Henderson's crimes but also Evelyn's complicity. Her silence, her decision to rent his house, her failure to speak up when it might have mattered. But there was something else, something Sarah didn't know and couldn't know. Something Evelyn had never told anyone. In the fall of 1995, a year before Thomas Henderson died, Evelyn had been leaving the library late one evening when she saw him in the parking lot, talking to a young woman Evelyn recognized as a new bank teller. The woman looked uncomfortable, stepping back, and Henderson was stepping forward, closing the distance. Evelyn had watched from behind her car, hidden in shadow, and had seen the woman finally extract herself and hurry to her vehicle. Evelyn had followed Henderson that night, not consciously planning it, but unable to stop herself. She had driven 3 cars back as he left the parking lot, heading not toward his home but toward County Road 9. He had pulled over near the old quarry access road, and Evelyn had parked at a distance and watched. He had waited there for almost an hour. Evelyn didn't know what he was waiting for or if he'd been planning to meet someone, but she had felt the weight of his intentions in the humid night air, and she had understood that she was watching a predator at his hunting ground. She had started her car and driven home, heart pounding, and had done nothing. She had told no one. And when Thomas Henderson died 9 months later, Evelyn had felt something like relief, followed immediately by crushing shame that relief was her response to another human's death. Now Sarah was threatening to expose all of it. The crimes, the silence, the complicity, the systems that had protected a monster because his last name was on the town hall cornerstone. And Evelyn couldn't let that happen. Not because she wanted to protect Henderson's memory. He deserved every bit of exposure and condemnation Sarah could bring, but because the exposure would destroy Riverside. It would tear apart families, end careers, make pariahs of good people who had simply failed to see what they didn't want to see. And it would destroy Evelyn herself, whose silence had been a betrayal she couldn't forgive. She tried one more time to convince Sarah to let it go. She invited her over on the evening of August 14, 1999, and made dinner, pasta with fresh tomatoes from her garden, bread from the bakery, wine that neither of them usually drank. They ate on the porch as the sun set, and Evelyn tried to explain without explaining, to convey the cost of truth without revealing her own culpability. But Sarah wouldn't listen. She was going to Detective Morrison on Monday, she said. She had enough to reopen multiple investigations. She was going to make Riverside face what it had done and failed to do. "Some truths are more important than comfort," Sarah said, her young face fierce in the dying light. "You taught me that. You taught me to ask questions." Evelyn felt something break inside her chest. Because Sarah was right. She had taught that. She believed that. But she had also learned that truth without mercy could be its own kind of violence. And she couldn't watch Sarah destroy herself and everyone around her in the pursuit of justice that came 20 years too late to save anyone. After Sarah left that night, Evelyn sat on her porch until past midnight, watching stars appear in the August sky. She thought about Jennifer Pratt and the other women whose names Sarah had written on her conspiracy board. She thought about the girl she had been at 16, running through yards and alleys. She thought about all the ways the world failed to protect the vulnerable and then punished them for seeking protection on their own. And she made a decision that would define the next 25 years of her life. She took out her stationery from the Riverside motel, left over from a conference she'd attended months earlier, and wrote a letter in her careful handwriting. Not a confession, not exactly. More like a record, a breadcrumb trail for whoever might eventually need to understand. She wrote it to no one in particular, or perhaps to herself, or perhaps to some future investigator who would be smarter and more thorough than the ones Riverside had now. Then she put it in a metal box along with the photographs she'd collected. Not sinister trophies, but documentary evidence, pictures of Henderson with women he'd targeted, taken by Evelyn during her months of surveillance in 1995 and early 1996. She had never known what to do with them. They had felt too explosive to bring forward and too important to destroy. So she had kept them hidden, waiting for courage or purpose to give them meaning. Now she buried them beneath the floorboards of the Henderson house, in the crawl space beneath the dining room where she and Sarah had spread out those case files. She worked in darkness, prying up old boards and digging a shallow grave for truth that was both too dangerous to speak and too vital to let die. She didn't know then that it would take 25 years for someone to find it. She didn't know she'd have 25 years to live with what came next. All she knew was that Sarah Mitchell was going to Detective Morrison on Monday morning, and Evelyn Jackson couldn't let that happen. The morning of August 15, 1999, dawned heavy and humid, the kind of heat that pressed down on Riverside like a hand over a mouth. Sarah Mitchell's alarm went off at 6 a.m. in her childhood bedroom, walls still decorated with high school basketball trophies and college pennants. She showered, dressed in her corner diner uniform, black pants, white polo shirt with the restaurant's logo, and kissed her mother's cheek before heading out the door. "Be safe," her mother called after her. The same words she said every morning, made routine and therefore meaningless until they weren't. Sarah's shift was supposed to end at 3 p.m. She was planning to go straight from the diner to the police station, the photocopied files waiting in her car, her rehearsed pitch ready for Detective Morrison. She was nervous but certain, the way only 19-year-olds can be, believing that truth was a sword sharp enough to cut through any resistance. She never made it to the police station. According to the investigation that followed, Sarah left the corner diner at 3:17 p.m. The owner, Bill Garrett, remembered because Sarah had stayed a few extra minutes to help the evening shift set up, refilling salt shakers and wiping down tables. She'd seemed normal, cheerful, even. She'd talked about maybe taking a summer class next semester, something to keep her moving forward. She walked to her car, a 1994 Ford Escort parked in the back lot. Security footage from the bank across the street showed her unlocking it, getting in. The camera angle was wrong to see what happened next, but her car was seen pulling out of the lot at 3:21 p.m., heading south on Main Street. Her normal route home would have taken her straight through downtown, then west on Jefferson Street. But at 4:02 p.m., a passing driver found Sarah's car abandoned on County Road 9, nearly 5 miles outside town in the opposite direction. The driver's side door was open. The keys were in the ignition. The engine was off but still warm. Sarah's purse was on the passenger seat, wallet intact. Her phone, a Nokia brick that she'd gotten for emergencies, was on the floor mat, battery dead. Nothing else. No signs of struggle. No blood. No Sarah. The first officers on scene were Deputy Brad Clemens and Officer Lisa Ward. They called it in immediately, recognizing Sarah's name from her applications to intern with the department. Within an hour, Detective Morrison was there with a growing sense of dread that his 30 years on the force had taught him to trust. They searched the area. The road was rarely traveled, mostly used by farmers accessing back fields. There were tire tracks in the dirt shoulder, Sarah's and at least 2 other vehicles, though the dry conditions made them difficult to identify. There were footprints too, multiple sets, disappearing into the soybeans that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. Detective Morrison called Sarah's parents. Her father answered and Morrison heard him make a sound no parent should ever make, a kind of wounded animal howl that Morrison would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. Within 2 hours, volunteers were organizing. By nightfall, half of Riverside was combing the fields and woods, calling Sarah's name into darkness that swallowed their voices without echo. They searched for 3 days. State police brought in dogs who lost Sarah's scent 100 yards from her car. Helicopters with thermal imaging found nothing. Divers checked the Tippecanoe River for the 4th time in the town's recent memory. First for Jennifer Pratt in 1989, then for 2 others in the years between, now for Sarah Mitchell. The investigation moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency that masked growing desperation. Morrison interviewed everyone Sarah knew. Friends described her as passionate about her studies, especially her interest in cold cases. Co-workers at the diner said she'd been distracted lately but wouldn't say why. Her academic advisor at Purdue mentioned she'd talked about doing independent research on victim advocacy. Morrison talked to her parents, who led him to Sarah's room. There, in a box under her bed, he found the files. Photocopies of reports on Jennifer Pratt and 3 other cases. Maps with locations marked. Notes in Sarah's handwriting connecting Thomas Henderson's name to all 4 disappearances. And a list of people she'd wanted to interview, including several prominent Riverside citizens who had been Henderson's friends and associates. Morrison felt his stomach turn, because he'd been on the force in 1989. He'd been the one who'd filed Jennifer Pratt's case as unsolved. And he remembered Thomas Henderson, impossible not to in a town this size. Henderson had been on the town council, a regular at Rotary Club meetings, a donor to the library and the schools. He'd sat 2 rows behind Morrison in church every Sunday until his death. And Morrison had dismissed Jennifer's concerns about him. Not explicitly, not in any way that would appear in official reports. But when Jennifer's best friend had mentioned Henderson's inappropriate attention during her initial interview, Morrison had made a note and then done nothing. Because accusing Thomas Henderson of anything in 1989 Riverside was unthinkable, and Morrison had been more concerned with protecting the town's reputation than pursuing unlikely leads. Now, staring at Sarah Mitchell's research, Morrison understood that his failure to act had potentially cost more than Jennifer's life. It had cost the lives of other women. And now, perhaps, it had cost Sarah hers. He didn't tell anyone about the files. Not yet. He told himself he needed to verify Sarah's research first, to determine if her theories had merit. But really, he was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if Sarah was right. Afraid of what it would do to Riverside's already traumatized community. Afraid of his own complicity. Instead, he focused on the immediate questions. Where had Sarah been going on County Road 9? She had no reason to be there. It was the opposite direction from her house, from the police station, from anywhere she normally went. Had she been meeting someone? Had someone lured her there? Morrison pulled phone records. Sarah had made 3 calls the night before she disappeared. 1 to her mother, 1 to her study partner at Purdue, and 1 to a number that took Morrison 2 days to trace, the number to Evelyn Jackson's home phone. The call had lasted 17 minutes. When Morrison showed up at the Henderson house to ask Evelyn about it, she'd seemed shaken but cooperative. Yes, Sarah had called. They'd discussed Sarah's research on cold cases. Evelyn had tried to discourage her, had suggested it was too emotionally taxing for someone so young. Sarah had been upset, felt like Evelyn was abandoning her intellectual curiosity. I feel terrible, Evelyn had said, sitting in her living room with Morrison, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank. I should have been more supportive. I just worried about her getting hurt. Morrison asked if Sarah had mentioned meeting anyone. Evelyn said no. He asked if Sarah seemed frightened. Evelyn said no, just determined. He asked if Evelyn had seen Sarah the day she disappeared. Evelyn said no. She'd been at school preparing her classroom for the new year. Morrison believed her. Everyone believed her. Because Evelyn Jackson was Miss Jackson, the teacher who kept butterscotch candies in her desk. The idea that she could be involved in Sarah's disappearance was as absurd as suspecting the Methodist pastor or the librarian or anyone else woven into Riverside's fabric of assumed goodness. But there was one person who didn't believe her. Sarah's mother, Patricia Mitchell. Patricia had met Evelyn a few times that summer when Sarah had brought her around. Patricia had liked her, quiet, thoughtful, clearly caring about Sarah in the way good teachers care about bright students. But after Sarah disappeared, Patricia became obsessed with every detail of her daughter's final weeks. She read Sarah's journals, her notes, every scrap of paper that might contain a clue, and she found something that bothered her. In Sarah's journal from August 13th, 2 days before she vanished, Sarah had written, "Miss J is afraid. She knows something but won't tell me. Why is she protecting him? He's dead. What can he do to her now?" Patricia brought this to Morrison. He read it with growing unease, because the him could only be Thomas Henderson. But protecting him from what? And why would Evelyn, who hadn't even lived in Riverside when Henderson died, feel the need to protect his reputation? Morrison went back to question Evelyn again, this time less friendly. Had she known Thomas Henderson? Yes, she'd met him a few times before his death, though she hadn't moved into his house until months after. Did Sarah seem to think Evelyn was hiding something? Evelyn looked stricken at this, said Sarah had accused her of being complicit in silence. But that was just youthful idealism misunderstanding the complexity of adult situations. Morrison pushed harder. What complexity? What was Sarah talking about? Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. She talked about how truth sometimes hurt innocent people more than it helped, how dredging up the past could traumatize a community already struggling. She talked about how Sarah was young and didn't understand that justice wasn't always simple. But she didn't admit to knowing anything specific. And without evidence, without Sarah's testimony, without the files Sarah had been planning to present, Morrison had nothing but conjecture and a grieving mother's desperate need to blame someone. The investigation stalled. Weeks became months. Volunteers stopped searching. The news crews left. Patricia Mitchell stood on the courthouse steps every Sunday, but fewer and fewer people stopped to talk to her. Riverside wanted to move forward, to heal, to forget. Evelyn Jackson returned to teaching that fall. Her fourth graders, that year, were a subdued group, children who'd absorbed their parents' anxiety and confusion. Evelyn taught with the same patience she always had, but there was something different now, a haunted quality that parents noticed but couldn't quite name. She stopped going to church. She stopped attending garden club meetings. She withdrew into the Henderson house, and the only time anyone saw her was at school or occasionally at the grocery store, moving through aisles like a ghost. Patricia Mitchell never stopped believing Evelyn knew something. She would drive past the Henderson house at night, staring at the lit windows, imagining her daughter's last moments, convinced that somewhere in that Victorian structure were answers she'd never be allowed to access. She wrote letters to the state police, to the FBI, to anyone who might listen. She demanded they search the house. She demanded they interrogate Evelyn more thoroughly. But there was no evidence, no grounds for a warrant, no legal justification for the kind of investigation Patricia was demanding. And as months stretched into years, even Patricia's most sympathetic supporters began to suggest, gently, that her focus on Evelyn Jackson was becoming unhealthy, a manifestation of grief rather than genuine suspicion. Morrison never stopped pulling Sarah's file, but he also never acted on what he'd found in her research. He told himself it was because Sarah's theories were circumstantial, that Thomas Henderson was dead and beyond prosecution, that destroying the man's reputation wouldn't bring Sarah back. But at night, alone with bourbon and guilt, Morrison knew the truth. He was protecting himself and the department and the town from having to confront how catastrophically they had failed. In the spring of 2000, Morrison received an anonymous letter. It arrived at the police station in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from Indianapolis. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text. Sarah Mitchell knew about the others. She knew about Jennifer Pratt and the pattern everyone ignored. She was going to make people listen. Someone couldn't let that happen. Look at who had the most to lose if Sarah exposed the truth. Not the dead man. The living ones who helped him hide. Morrison read it a dozen times, searching for clues in the word choices, the phrasing, the implications. The living ones who helped him hide. Was that an accusation? A confession? A warning? He traced the postmark but got nowhere. He analyzed the typeface, standard computer font, probably Times New Roman, impossible to identify. He considered everyone who might have sent it. A witness? An accomplice? Someone who'd been protecting Henderson and now felt guilty? Or was it from someone trying to deflect suspicion onto others? He never figured it out. He filed the letter with Sarah's case and tried to move on with his life, though his drinking got worse and his wife stopped asking if he was okay because she already knew the answer. Evelyn saw the change in Morrison at school events and town gatherings. She watched him deteriorate over the years, aging decades in the span of months. She knew she had done that to him, not directly, but through the ripples of her actions spreading outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. She considered confessing 100 times, rehearsing the words in her head late at night. I need to tell you what really happened, but she never did, because confessing meant explaining, and explaining meant revealing things that would destroy more than just herself. It meant exposing Henderson's crimes in ways that would implicate dozens of people who had looked the other way. It meant forcing Riverside to confront the fact that Jennifer Pratt and at least 3 other women had died because respectability mattered more than safety. It meant admitting that Sarah Mitchell's idealism had been right and everyone else's pragmatism had been cowardice. And it meant admitting what Evelyn had done to protect that terrible equilibrium. In 2001, Evelyn left Riverside. She told the school board she needed to be closer to family in Oregon, which was true in the most technical sense. She had a distant cousin there she'd met twice. She packed her belongings with methodical care, leaving behind the Henderson house and everything it represented. She didn't sell her furniture, just left it for the estate sale that would follow. She donated most of her books to the library, keeping only the Mary Oliver and Rumi collections that had been her companions through the darkest hours. She drove west across America in her Honda Civic, stopping at motels and diners, always choosing places where no one would remember her. She reached Oregon in early September and found work as a substitute teacher, then eventually as a librarian at a small branch in suburban Portland. She rented a cottage with a garden. She adopted a cat named Poet. She built a quiet life designed to inflict the least possible harm on the world around her. She never forgot Sarah Mitchell. Every August 15th, she took the day off and spent it in silence. Not quite prayer, but something close. A reckoning with memory and guilt that felt like stones in her chest. She followed the news from Riverside online, reading about Morrison's retirement in 2019, about Patricia Mitchell's death in 2017 from cancer that everyone said was really heartbreak wearing a medical disguise. She wrote letters she never sent, to Patricia, to Morrison, to Sarah herself. She filled journals with confessions that no one would ever read, documenting everything she'd done and why she'd done it. Not for absolution. She was past believing in absolution. Just for the record, for truth to exist somewhere even if it never saw daylight. She thought she could live like this forever, half a person, going through the motions of existence while the real Evelyn remained buried beneath layers of assumed normalcy. She thought the past could stay buried along with everything else she'd hidden beneath those floorboards. She was wrong. When the Henderson house was scheduled for demolition in 2024, she'd heard about it through the Riverside grapevine that persisted even on social media. Someone posted in a Riverside Memories Facebook group, "They're finally tearing down the old Henderson place. End of an era." Evelyn had read that post on her phone while shelving books at the library, and she'd felt time collapse. She'd known, with the certainty of someone who'd spent 25 years waiting for this moment, that the box would be found, that her careful burial had only delayed the inevitable. She'd considered running. She had a go bag in her closet, always had cash, fake ID she'd bought years ago just in case, papers that could get her into Canada or Mexico. She could disappear again, this time more thoroughly. But she was 60 years old and tired. Tired of running, tired of lying, tired of being half alive. And there was a part of her, The part that had once believed in justice and truth and the importance of asking hard questions, that wanted it to be over. So when the Oregon State Police showed up at her door, she'd let them in. She'd cooperated with every step of the extradition. And when Detective Sarah Chun, named Sarah, the universe's idea of irony, sat across from her in that interview room in Riverside, Evelyn had felt something like relief. She was looking for the truth, Evelyn had said, and I couldn't let her find it. Chun leaned forward, her face carefully neutral. She was younger than Evelyn remembered Morrison being, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. She had Sarah Mitchell's case file open in front of her. Much thicker now after 25 years of leads that went nowhere. Tell me what happened on August 15, 1999, Chun said. Evelyn took a breath that felt like it came from the bottom of a well. I need to start earlier than that. You need to understand the whole story. Then start wherever you need to, Chun said, clicking her pen. We have all the time in the world. And so Evelyn began to tell the truth. Not the whole truth, not yet. That would come in pieces over the interrogations that followed. But she started with Thomas Henderson and Jennifer Pratt, with her own surveillance and silence, with the weight of knowing what no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. She told Chun about Sarah's research, about the phone call the night before Sarah disappeared, about her desperate attempts to convince Sarah to let sleeping demons lie. She told her about the letter she'd written and the box she'd buried, insurance against her own cowardice or perhaps evidence of it. But I haven't told you what happened to Sarah, Chun said after 2 hours of careful questioning. Where is she, Evelyn? Evelyn looked at her hands, 60-year-old hands, marked by time and labor and guilt that no amount of garden work could scrub away. I don't know. You don't know, Chun repeated, her voice flat. I don't know, Evelyn said again. That's the truth. I know what I did, and I know it led to Sarah's disappearance. But I don't know where she is. Chun stood abruptly, her chair scraping against linoleum. You're telling me you wrote a letter that essentially confessed to involvement in her disappearance, but you don't know what happened to her? I wrote that letter before anything happened, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I wrote it the night before. I was planning. She stopped, swallowed. I was planning to make her disappear, to stop her from going to Morrison. But I didn't go through with it. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Chun sat back down slowly. Explain. I had it all planned, Evelyn said. I was going to call Sarah on August 15th. Tell her I'd changed my mind, that I'd help her present her findings to Morrison. I'd ask her to meet me on County Road 9. Somewhere private where we could talk without the whole town watching. And then I was going to, I don't know what I was going to do. Make her understand she had to stop? Threaten her? I hadn't gotten that far in my planning. I just knew I couldn't let her expose everything. But, Chun prompted. But I didn't call her, Evelyn said. I woke up that morning and I couldn't do it. I couldn't be that person. Couldn't hurt a 19-year-old girl who was only trying to do the right thing. So I didn't call. I went to school and worked on my classroom and tried to pretend I wasn't the kind of person who'd even contemplated what I'd contemplated. Then how did Sarah end up on County Road 9? Chun asked. I don't know, Evelyn whispered. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 25 years. Chun studied her for a long moment. You're saying someone else had the same idea you did. Or Sarah went there for another reason entirely, Evelyn said. Maybe she was investigating something on her own. Maybe. Or maybe, Chun interrupted. You're lying to minimize your involvement. Maybe you did call her. Maybe you did meet her there. And maybe whatever you planned went wrong. And you've been running from it ever since. Evelyn met her eyes. I wrote that letter before she disappeared. The date on the stationery, the date I wrote at the top, August 14th. You can verify that through handwriting analysis, paper aging, whatever tests you need. I wrote it planning to do something terrible, yes. But I didn't do it. And then Sarah disappeared anyway. And I've spent every day since wondering if I could have prevented it if I'd just been braver in the first place. How would being braver have prevented it? If I'd gone to Morrison myself, Evelyn said. If I'd told him what I knew about Henderson, what I'd seen, what Sarah was about to expose. If I'd faced the consequences of my own silence instead of trying to silence Sarah, maybe she would have trusted me enough to be more careful. Maybe whoever really took her wouldn't have had the opportunity. Chun was quiet for a moment. Then, who do you think took her? I don't know, Evelyn said. But Thomas Henderson wasn't the only person who benefited from silence about his crimes. There were others, friends, business partners, people who'd enabled him or looked the other way. If Sarah exposed Henderson, she'd expose all of them too. Any of them had more reason to stop her than I did. Give me names. Evelyn did. She named 6 men, all prominent Riverside citizens in 1999, all dead now except for 2. Douglas Reeves, who'd been Henderson's business partner in a real estate development company, and Martin Shaw, who'd been police chief from 1985 to 2002. Chen's pen stopped moving. Martin Shaw. He was close friends with Henderson, Evelyn said. Golfing partners, both on the Rotary Club board. And he would have known exactly what Sarah was planning to do because she'd called the station to make an appointment with Morrison. If Shaw heard about that, if he knew what Sarah had found, he would have understood the implications for the department's reputation. For his legacy. Shaw died in 2018, Chun said, pulling up information on her tablet. But Reeves is still alive. He's 83, living in a nursing home in Lafayette. Then maybe he has answers, Evelyn said. Or maybe Sarah's disappearance will remain unsolved forever. All I can tell you is what I know, what I did, and what I didn't do. The rest. She shook her head. The rest I've spent 25 years trying to understand. The interrogation of Douglas Reeves took place on March 28, 2024, in a sunlit room at Meadowbrook Nursing Home, where he'd lived since a stroke in 2020 left him partially paralyzed. Chun brought 2 state police investigators with her, along with recording equipment and a court order compelling Reeves to answer questions about events from 25 years prior. Reeves sat in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at a garden he could no longer walk through. He was pale and thin, his hands trembling with palsy, his voice reedy but still sharp. When Chen explained why they'd come, his watery eyes focused on her with surprising clarity. Thomas Henderson, he said slowly. Haven't heard that name in a long time. We're investigating the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell in 1999, Chen said. We have reason to believe Sarah was researching crimes committed by Henderson. We need to know what you knew about his activities. Reeves was quiet for so long Chen thought he might refuse to answer. Then he said, I knew everything. The room seemed to contract. Chun felt her heart rate spike but kept her voice level. Explain. Thomas and I were partners for 30 years, Reeves said. We developed half the commercial properties in Riverside. Made a lot of money together. And yes, I knew he had habits, predatory habits. I knew about the women who complained and then suddenly dropped their complaints. I knew about the settlements his family paid to make problems go away. I knew, and I said nothing because he made me rich. Did you know about Jennifer Pratt? Chen asked. I knew he was obsessed with her, Reeves said. Talked about her constantly. I told him to leave her alone, that he was going to get himself in trouble. He laughed at me, said he was untouchable, said his family had protected this town for 100 years and the town owed him protection in return. Did he kill her? I don't know, Reeves said. Not for certain. But Jennifer disappeared, and Thomas seemed satisfied after that, like he'd solved a problem. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Chun leaned forward. What about Sarah Mitchell? Did you know she was investigating Henderson's crimes? Reeves's eyes clouded. Martin told me, he said quietly. Martin Shaw. He called me in August '99. Said there was a girl asking questions, digging into old cases. Said she was going to destroy everything. Henderson's reputation, the department's credibility, the town's peace. He asked me what I thought we should do. And what did you tell him? I told him to let it go, Reeves said. I told him Thomas was already dead. That there was no point protecting a dead man's reputation. Let the girl find whatever she was going to find. But Martin, he trailed off, shaking his head. Martin what? Chun pressed. Martin couldn't let it go, Reeves said. His whole career had been built on protecting Riverside's image. He'd buried complaints about Henderson, lost evidence, redirected investigations. If Sarah Mitchell exposed Henderson, she'd expose Martin too. He'd lose his pension, his reputation, everything. He couldn't allow that. Are you saying Martin Shaw was involved in Sarah's disappearance? Reeves looked out the window at the garden. I'm saying Martin called me again on August 16th, the day after Sarah disappeared. He told me there'd been an incident, that the girl had been in an accident, that it was taken care of. He said I didn't need to worry, that no one would ever find anything. Chun felt cold spread through her chest. An accident. That's what he called it, Reeves said. I didn't believe him. I knew what he meant, and I said nothing. Again. His voice cracked. I've said nothing for 25 years. I've lived with it every day. And now I'm dying, kidney failure. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months, and I can't take it with me. I won't. Chun gave him a moment, then asked, Did Martin say where this accident happened? No. But there was a property, an old grain silo on County Road 9. Thomas and I owned it through one of our LLCs. It was supposed to be demolished in 2000, but the funding fell through. It just sat there, abandoned. Martin had access to the keys because we'd let the department use it for training exercises. If I were looking for Sarah Mitchell. He didn't finish the sentence. Chun left Meadowbrook with evidence that felt simultaneously solid and impossibly fragile. Reeves's testimony was devastating. But he was also a dying man with a conveniently timed conscience and no physical evidence to support his claims. Martin Shaw was beyond prosecution, dead for 6 years. And the property he'd mentioned, Chun pulled up county records on her laptop in the parking lot, had been sold in 2003 and the silo demolished in 2004 to make way for a Dollar General. But there were other avenues. Chun requested Shaw's financial records from 1999, his phone records, his work schedule. She pulled personnel files from the Riverside Police Department, looking for anyone who might have noticed irregularities. She interviewed retired officers, asking carefully neutral questions about Shaw's leadership and decision-making. And she went back to Evelyn Jackson. Evelyn had been held without bond, charged with conspiracy and obstruction pending further investigation. She sat in the Riverside County Jail, isolated from other inmates for her own protection, spending her days reading library books and writing in notebooks the jail provided. When Chun came to her cell on April 3rd, Evelyn looked almost relieved. Douglas Reeves told me Martin Shaw was involved, Chun said without preamble. Did you know that? I suspected, Evelyn said. Sarah had mentioned calling the police station to make an appointment. I'd worried at the time that Shaw might hear about it, might try to stop her. But I had no proof, and I was too consumed with my own guilt to think clearly about alternatives. Why didn't you tell me this during our first interview? Because I was still protecting the dead, Evelyn said. Still trying to minimize the damage. But I'm done with that. Ask me anything. I'll tell you everything I know. So Chin did. She asked about the timeline, about every interaction Evelyn had with Sarah in the days before her disappearance. She asked about the letter, about Evelyn's plans, about what she'd hoped to accomplish by burying that box. And slowly, painstakingly, a fuller picture emerged. Evelyn had written the letter on August 14th, yes, but she'd also made a call that night, not to Sarah, but to Martin Shaw. She'd called to tell him about Sarah's research, ostensibly to ask what she should do. But really, she admitted now, to transfer responsibility, to make it someone else's problem. I told Shaw that Sarah had found evidence implicating Henderson in multiple disappearances, Evelyn said, her voice hollow. I told him she was planning to go to Morrison on Monday, and Shaw said he'd handle it, that he'd talk to the girl, explain why pursuing dead men was pointless. You gave him a heads up, Chin said. I gave him the opportunity to stop her, Evelyn corrected. I told myself I was trying to protect Sarah, trying to get an authority figure to convince her to back off. But I knew Shaw had more to lose than anyone. I knew what he might do, and I called him anyway. Chun sat back, processing. So you didn't directly harm Sarah, but you set in motion the events that led to her disappearance. Yes, Evelyn whispered. That's exactly what I did. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm 60 years old and I'm tired of lying, Evelyn said. Because Patricia Mitchell died without knowing what happened to her daughter. Because Frank Morrison drank himself into liver disease trying to solve a case he never could have solved because the perpetrator was his boss. Because Sarah Mitchell deserves better than being forgotten. And because I can't be the coward who stays silent again. Chun reported Evelyn's new testimony to the prosecutor, who immediately upgraded the charges to accessory to murder. But there was still no body, no physical evidence, no way to prove definitively that Sarah had been killed rather than running away or meeting some other fate. Until they found the silo. The property where the old grain silo had stood was now a Dollar General parking lot, paved over with asphalt and painted lines. But Chun obtained permission to excavate, and on April 15, 2024, a crew broke through the concrete foundation that had been poured in 2004. Beneath it, in what had been the basement level of the silo, they found remains. The forensic anthropologist who examined the site found human bones, a nearly complete skeleton, female, age consistent with late teens or early 20s. Cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skull. And buried with the remains were personal effects. A corner diner name tag engraved with Sarah M., a Purdue class ring, and a Nokia phone with a cracked screen. Sarah Mitchell had been found. The news broke like a thunderclap over Riverside. Within hours, national media descended. Sarah's story, missing for 25 years, finally found. The truth involving corruption and cover-up became headline news. Journalists interviewed anyone who'd known Sarah or Evelyn or Shaw. They dug through archives, building narratives about small-town secrets and justice delayed. Patricia Mitchell's sister, Sarah's Aunt Maria, gave a tearful press conference. "My sister died not knowing what happened to her child," Maria said, her voice shaking. "She died believing Sarah might still come home. And all this time, Sarah was buried beneath a building, hidden by people who were supposed to protect her. I'm grateful we finally have answers, but I will never forgive what was stolen from my family." Frank Morrison, now 72 and dying of liver disease, watched the press conference from his hospice bed. He'd known, as soon as the remains were found, exactly what had happened. Shaw had called him on August 16, 1999, said there'd been an incident with the Mitchell girl, said it was handled. Morrison had suspected but hadn't pressed, hadn't wanted to know, had let his mentor and friend commit murder and hide the evidence because confronting it would have destroyed them both. Now everyone knew, and Morrison, who'd spent his career pursuing justice, understood that he'd been the greatest obstacle to it. He called Chun from hospice. "I need to give a statement," he said, his voice barely audible over the oxygen machine. "I need to tell you everything I knew and suspected and failed to act on." Chun drove to his bedside with a recorder and a witness. Morrison talked for 3 hours, detailing decades of cover-ups and redirected investigations. He talked about complaints against Henderson that disappeared from files. He talked about Shaw's instructions to drop certain leads. He talked about his own cowardice, his prioritization of order over justice, his failure to protect women like Jennifer Pratt and Sarah Mitchell. "I'm culpable," Morrison said at the end. "I should be charged alongside Evelyn Jackson. What she did was terrible, but what I failed to do was worse. I had the power to stop it, and I chose not to." "Martin Shaw killed Sarah," Chin said gently. "You didn't." "I created the conditions that allowed him to kill her," Morrison said. "That's the same thing. Please charge me. Let me be held accountable before I die." But the prosecutor, after reviewing Morrison's statement, determined that while his failures were profound, they didn't constitute criminal culpability for events that occurred after Shaw acted independently. Morrison would face no charges, though his statement was entered into the public record, ensuring his legacy would be defined by his failures rather than his 3 decades of service. He died 6 weeks later, and only Chun and Morrison's ex-wife attended the funeral. The forensic work on Sarah's remains continued. DNA confirmed her identity beyond doubt. The trauma pattern suggested she'd been struck from behind, likely dying instantly. An analysis of the concrete that had been poured over her resting place confirmed it had been laid in 2004. meaning her body had been hidden in the silo basement for 5 years before being sealed forever. Or so Shaw had thought. As Chun dug deeper into Shaw's activities in 1999, she found financial records showing he'd paid $15,000 cash to a construction company in late August 1999, supposedly for property improvements that were never documented. She found phone records showing Shaw had called Reeves 16 times in the week after Sarah disappeared. And she found a journal Shaw had kept, discovered by his widow when Chun requested access to his personal effects. The journal was damning. Shaw had written extensively about his resentment toward entitled college kids who thought they could rewrite history. He'd written about Sarah specifically, calling her a threat to everything we've built. And on August 15, 1999, he'd written, "Did what I had to do. God forgive me, or don't. Either way, it's done." The entries stopped after that. Shaw had apparently been too afraid to continue documenting his thoughts after committing murder. Chun assembled everything into a comprehensive report. The conclusion was unavoidable. Martin Shaw, with knowledge from Evelyn Jackson and possibly assistance from Douglas Reeves, had lured Sarah Mitchell to the silo on County Road 9, killed her, and hidden her body in the basement. When the property was sold in 2003, Shaw had ensured the new owner poured a concrete foundation that would seal Sarah's grave permanently. Reeves died on May 3, 2024, before he could be formally charged. His testimony had been crucial, but his death meant one less person to hold accountable. That left Evelyn Jackson. The prosecutor offered her a deal: plead guilty to accessory to murder, provide complete testimony about everything she knew, and receive a sentence of 20 years with possibility of parole. Refuse and face trial with potential life imprisonment without parole. Evelyn took the deal, not because she hoped for eventual freedom. She was 60 and understood she'd likely die in prison, but because pleading guilty meant a full accounting of what had happened would enter the public record. It meant Sarah's story would be told completely and accurately. It meant Riverside would have to face its sins rather than burying them again. Her guilty plea hearing took place on June 12, 2024, in a packed courtroom. Evelyn stood before Judge Catherine Brennan, wearing a prison jumpsuit, her gray hair pulled back, her face lined with age and remorse. "Miss Jackson," Judge Brennan said, "you've entered a guilty plea to accessory to murder in the death of Sarah Mitchell. Do you understand the consequences of this plea?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn said. "The court has reviewed your statement and the evidence against you. Before I impose sentence, I'm going to allow victim impact statements. Miss Mitchell's family has requested to speak." Maria Chun, Sarah's aunt, approached the podium. She looked at Evelyn with eyes full of pain. "You were a teacher," she said. "Sarah trusted you. She looked up to you. And you betrayed her in the worst possible way. You gave her to a murderer to protect secrets that weren't even yours. My sister died of heartbreak because of you. Sarah died of violence because of you. I will never forgive you. And I hope you spend every day for the rest of your life feeling even a fraction of the pain you've caused." Evelyn listened without flinching, accepting every word as deserved. When it was time for her own statement, Evelyn stood and faced the courtroom. She looked at Maria, at the journalists, at the people of Riverside who'd come to watch their former teacher be sentenced. "There's nothing I can say that will undo the harm I've caused," she said quietly. "No apology that will bring Sarah back or give her mother the peace she deserved. I can only tell you that I think about Sarah Mitchell every day. I think about her intelligence, her passion, her belief that truth mattered more than comfort. She was right. Truth does matter more. And I betrayed that truth because I was afraid. I was afraid of consequences, afraid of chaos, afraid of being the person who destroyed Riverside's illusion of safety. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She was braver at 19 than I've been in 60 years of living. The world lost something precious when she died, and I am responsible for that loss. I accept my punishment. I accept that I will die in prison, and I accept that no amount of remorse can balance the scales of what I've done." Judge Brennan imposed the agreed sentence: 20 years in state prison. Evelyn was led away, and Riverside began the long process of reckoning with what its silence had cost. The summer of 2024 was unlike any Riverside had experienced in its 140-year history. The small town found itself under a microscope, every institution examined, every past decision questioned. The revelations about Thomas Henderson, Martin Shaw, and the systematic failures that had allowed predators to operate with impunity didn't just dominate local conversation. They sparked a regional reckoning about how small towns protected their own at the expense of vulnerable people. The Riverside Police Department faced immediate consequences. The state attorney general launched an investigation into decades of case files, looking for patterns of mishandled complaints and buried evidence. They found plenty. Jennifer Pratt's case was only the most obvious. There were at least 8 other complaints against Henderson from 1982 to 1996 that had never been properly investigated. There were 3 other missing persons cases from surrounding counties with suspicious similarities. And there were dozens of assault and harassment complaints against other prominent men that had been dismissed with minimal investigation. Chief Angela Rodriguez, who'd taken over the department in 2020, held a public meeting in late June where she addressed a standing-room-only crowd at the town hall. "I cannot undo the past," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "I cannot bring back the women we failed to protect. But I can promise you that this department is undergoing a complete transformation. We are implementing new protocols for investigating sexual assault and harassment. We are bringing in independent oversight. We are retraining every officer on victim-centered approaches. And we are reopening every cold case involving women to ensure nothing was missed or deliberately buried." The crowd's response was mixed. Some applauded, grateful for accountability. Others remained skeptical that meaningful change was possible in a place so steeped in protecting its image. The Riverside school system faced its own crisis. Parents demanded to know how Evelyn Jackson had been employed for years after Sarah's disappearance, whether administrators had suspected anything, whether children had been safe in her classroom. Superintendent David Park held multiple community forums, explaining that Evelyn had never been charged with anything until 2024, that she'd passed all background checks, that there had been no indication she posed any danger to students. But, he acknowledged, "We failed to ask harder questions about Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. We accepted easy answers because they were comfortable. We owe it to this community to do better." The school board voted to establish the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship for students interested in criminal justice, funded by donations that poured in from across the country. They also implemented new policies requiring administrators to report any concerns about employee behavior to independent oversight committees rather than handling matters internally. For Maria Chun, Sarah's aunt, the answers brought both relief and renewed grief. She'd spent 25 years wondering, and now she knew. But knowing meant confronting the horror of Sarah's final moments, the betrayal by someone Sarah had trusted, the years her body had lain beneath concrete while the town went about its business above her. Maria worked with Detective Chun, no relation, though the shared surname felt like fate, to establish the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to supporting cold case investigations and victim advocacy programs across Indiana. The foundation's first grant went to funding additional forensic resources for the state police, ensuring other families wouldn't have to wait 25 years for answers. Sarah wanted to be a prosecutor, Maria said at the foundation's launch in September 2024. She wanted to give voice to victims who weren't heard. "We can't give her that future, but we can honor it by doing the work she would have done." The foundation received donations from unexpected sources. Douglas Reeves's estate, following his death, included a $2 million bequest, his attempt at atonement for decades of complicity. Martin Shaw's widow, horrified by her husband's crimes, donated their home to be sold with proceeds going to the foundation. Even Frank Morrison's estate, such as it was, included a small donation and a letter apologizing to Sarah's family. But perhaps the most significant change came in how Riverside talked about its history. For generations, the town had celebrated the Henderson family as founders and benefactors, their name on buildings and streets. Now, the town council voted to rename Henderson Hall at the high school to Mitchell Hall. They removed Thomas Henderson's portrait from the courthouse. They added new historical markers acknowledging not just the town's proud moments but also its failures, the women who'd been harmed, the justice that had been denied, the cost of silence. Not everyone supported these changes. There was a faction that argued the town was being too hard on itself, that Henderson's crimes shouldn't erase his family's legitimate contributions, that constantly dwelling on past failures prevented moving forward. These debates played out in town council meetings, on social media, in heated conversations at the corner diner where Sarah had worked her last shift. But slowly, painfully, Riverside began to change. Parents talked to their children about consent and believing victims. Teachers incorporated Sarah's story into lessons about civic responsibility and speaking truth to power. The Methodist Church, where Evelyn had once attended, held a series of forums on institutional accountability and decomplicity in harm. Detective Sarah Chun became an unexpected figure of moral authority in this transformation. She'd solved the case that had haunted Riverside for a generation, but she'd done it by refusing to accept comfortable lies. At community meetings, people asked her how to rebuild trust, how to ensure this never happened again. Her answer was always the same: believe victims, investigate thoroughly, don't protect reputations at the expense of truth, and never, ever assume that someone's status in the community makes them incapable of harm. Chun also advocated for Evelyn Jackson in a limited way. Not for leniency. Chun believed Evelyn deserved her sentence, but for understanding the complexity of complicity. Evelyn Jackson made terrible choices, Chun said in an interview with the Indianapolis Star. But those choices were made in a system that taught women their safety mattered less than men's reputations. She's culpable, yes, but so is every person who created the conditions that made her believe silence was her only option. This nuanced view frustrated some who wanted Evelyn painted as purely evil, but it resonated with others, particularly women who recognized themselves in Evelyn's impossible calculations. How many times had they stayed quiet about harassment? How many times had they softened accusations to avoid being labeled difficult? How many times had they protected themselves by failing to protect others? These conversations were uncomfortable but necessary. They happened in living rooms and coffee shops, in therapy sessions and support groups. Riverside was learning that accountability wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about examining the systems that enabled harm and actively dismantling them. By the fall of 2024, visible changes were everywhere. The police department had hired 3 new officers specifically trained in trauma-informed investigation. The hospital added a full-time sexual assault nurse examiner. The high school implemented comprehensive consent education. The town council established an independent review board to examine complaints against public officials. And in October, on what would have been Sarah Mitchell's 45th birthday, Riverside held its first annual Truth and Accountability Day. Hundreds gathered at the courthouse steps where Patricia Mitchell had once stood alone with her daughter's photograph. They listened to speakers talk about the importance of believing victims. They observed a moment of silence for Sarah and all the women whose voices had been silenced. And they unveiled a memorial. A bronze statue of Sarah holding books, gazing toward the future she'd never gotten to see. Maria Chun stood before the statue, tears streaming down her face. "My niece didn't get to live the life she deserved," she said. "But maybe, because of her, other young women will be safer. Maybe other families won't have to wonder for 25 years. Maybe Riverside has learned that protecting the truth is more important than protecting comfort." The crowd applauded, though many were crying. Among them stood former students of Evelyn Jackson's, now adults with children of their own. They struggled with reconciling their memories of Miss Jackson's kindness with the knowledge of her terrible choice. Some felt betrayed, their nostalgia poisoned. Others felt a complicated grief for both Sarah Mitchell and the teacher who'd failed her so catastrophically. One former student, Jessica Torres, now a social worker in Indianapolis, gave an interview about her experience. "Miss Jackson taught me to think critically, to ask questions, to believe I could make a difference," Jessica said. "Those lessons were real, even if she couldn't live up to them herself. I think that's the hard part. People aren't all good or all bad. Miss Jackson did something unforgivable, but she also impacted hundreds of children positively. Both things are true, and we have to hold both truths at once." This mature, complicated perspective gradually became more common in Riverside's discourse. The town was learning to hold space for nuance while still maintaining clear moral lines about accountability and justice. 2 years later, fall 2026. The Riverside Community Center opened in September 2026, funded partly by the Sarah Mitchell Foundation and partly by state grants for victim services. The center offered counseling, legal advocacy, and support groups for survivors of violence. It also housed a resource library and community meeting spaces for organizations working on prevention and education. Detective Chun, who'd been promoted to lead the new cold case unit for the state police, spoke at the opening ceremony. She looked older. The last 2 years had been intense, with media attention, additional investigations into other cases, and the emotional toll of confronting systemic failure on such a massive scale. But she also looked purposeful, grounded in work that mattered. This center exists because Sarah Mitchell asked questions that made people uncomfortable, Chun said, because her family refused to let her be forgotten, and because this community decided that acknowledging failure is the first step toward doing better. The work isn't finished, it never will be, but this is a tangible commitment to change. Among those attending the opening was Evelyn Jackson's younger sister, Anne, who'd flown in from Chicago. She'd been estranged from Evelyn since the arrest, grappling with rage and grief and confusion about how her quiet sister had become complicit in murder. But recently, Anne had begun corresponding with Evelyn in prison, trying to understand, not to excuse, but to process. "My sister did something terrible," Anne told a small group of journalists. "I will never defend that, but I also grew up in the same world she did, where we learned that staying safe meant staying quiet, where we learned that men's feelings mattered more than women's boundaries. Evelyn made the wrong choice, the catastrophically wrong choice, but she made it in a context that millions of women recognize. That doesn't absolve her. But maybe understanding that context helps prevent the next person from making similar calculations." At the Indiana Women's Prison, where Evelyn was serving her sentence, she'd become involved in a program teaching literacy to other inmates. She worked in the library, recommended books with the same instinct she'd had as a teacher and librarian, and participated in a writing group that produced a quarterly newsletter. She'd aged visibly in 2 years, her hair completely white now, her posture bent, her health declining from stress and institutional living. But people who worked with her noted that she seemed more present than when she'd arrived, less ghost-like. Accepting responsibility and facing consequences had, paradoxically, freed her from the half-life she'd been living for 25 years. She wrote regularly to Maria Chun, letters that Maria sometimes read and sometimes burned unread. When Maria did read them, she found not excuses but acknowledgement. Evelyn wrote about Sarah, her intelligence, her passion, her courage. She wrote about Jennifer Pratt and the other women Henderson had harmed. She wrote about the weight of complicity and the impossibility of atonement. "I understand if you never forgive me," one letter read. "I haven't forgiven myself, but I want you to know that Sarah's voice matters more in death than mine does in life. Everything I do now, the teaching, the work with other inmates, the testimony I've given for other cases, is in service of the principles Sarah lived by. It's not payment. Nothing could be. But it's all I have to offer." Maria didn't respond to most of the letters, but she kept them, stored in a box with Sarah's belongings. Maybe someday she'd know what to do with them. For now, they existed as a record, complicated, painful, insufficient, but true. 4 years later, spring 2028. Mitchell Hall at Riverside High School graduated its first class under the new name. The ceremony took place on a warm May evening, and among the graduates was Emma Rodriguez, daughter of Police Chief Angela Rodriguez. Emma had written her valedictorian speech about Sarah Mitchell, about the importance of speaking truth even when it costs you everything. "Sarah Mitchell was 19 when she died," Emma said to the assembled crowd. "Only 6 years older than we are now. She could have stayed quiet. She could have focused on her own future and let the past stay buried. But she believed that justice mattered more than comfort, and she paid the ultimate price for that belief. We honor her not just by remembering her, but by carrying forward her courage, by refusing to be silent when we witness injustice, by believing victims even when it's inconvenient, by building a world where young women like Sarah don't have to choose between safety and truth." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Maria Chen, now 72 and slowed by arthritis but still sharp and determined, wiped tears from her eyes. Beside her sat Detective Chun. They'd become close over the years, brought together by the case that had defined both their lives. They held hands as Emma finished her speech, finding comfort in shared purpose and the tangible evidence that Sarah's death had catalyzed genuine change. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation had, by 2028, helped solve 17 cold cases across Indiana and neighboring states. They'd provided grants to train over 300 law enforcement officers in victim-centered investigation techniques. They'd funded legal advocates who'd helped hundreds of survivors navigate the justice system. And they'd established scholarship programs that had sent 43 students to college to study criminal justice, social work, and advocacy. Riverside itself had become something of a model for other small towns grappling with past failures. Other communities sent representatives to study Riverside's transformation, how they'd balanced accountability with healing, how they'd changed institutional practices, how they'd educated a new generation to do better. It wasn't perfect. There were still people in Riverside who resented the ongoing attention, who wished the town could move past what they saw as an unfortunate chapter. There were still complaints that the police department over-investigated cases now, that the pendulum had swung too far toward believing accusers. There were still families whose reputations had been damaged by associations with Henderson or Shaw who felt unfairly tarnished. But there was also measurable change. Reports of sexual assault and harassment in Riverside had increased, not because assault was more common, but because victims now believed they would be taken seriously. Prosecution rates had increased. Conviction rates had increased. And, perhaps most importantly, prevention programs had reduced incidents among young people who'd grown up with comprehensive education about consent, respect, and bystander intervention. The corner diner, where Sarah had worked her last shift, underwent renovation in 2028. The new owner, a young woman named Rachel Martinez who'd moved to Riverside specifically because of its commitment to change, turned it into a community gathering space. She added a wall honoring Sarah, photographs of her, excerpts from her writings about justice, information about the foundation. She also created a program hiring and mentoring young people interested in criminal justice careers, offering them paid internships and connecting them with professionals in the field. Sarah Mitchell should have had the chance to change the world, Rachel said at the diner's reopening. Since she can't, we have to do it for her. 6 years later, August 2030. The air was thick with late summer humidity as Emma Rodriguez walked across the Indiana University campus, her first day as a freshman pursuing a degree in criminal justice. She'd chosen IU partly because it was Sarah Mitchell's alma mater, though Sarah had never gotten to finish her education there. Emma felt the weight of that legacy but also the privilege of getting to complete a journey Sarah had started. In her backpack was a worn copy of Mary Oliver's collected poems, the same edition Evelyn Jackson had once carried, now passed to Emma through Maria Chun. Maria had given it to her at graduation, saying, "Sarah loved poetry. Miss Jackson did too. Don't let their failure to live up to these words mean the words aren't worth reading." Emma had spent the summer reading and rereading, underlining passages that resonated. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Oliver asked on a page worn soft from decades of handling. Emma didn't have a perfect answer yet, but she knew it involved justice, truth, and refusing the kind of silence that had cost Sarah her life. At the Indiana Women's Prison, Evelyn Jackson marked her 6th year of incarceration by facilitating a workshop on poetry and healing. She was 66 now, rail-thin from the stomach cancer she'd been diagnosed with the previous year. The doctors gave her maybe 18 months. She declined aggressive treatment, accepting that prison would be where her story ended. But she wasn't idle in that ending. She'd spent 6 years teaching other inmates to read, to write, to think critically about the systems that had failed them. Many of the women she worked with were themselves victims of abuse, of poverty, of circumstance, who'd made desperate choices in impossible situations. Evelyn recognized herself in them, the terrible calculations of survival that sometimes led to harm. She'd also become a resource for investigators working cold cases involving institutional cover-ups. She'd testified in 3 other cases about the psychology of complicity, helping juries understand how good people made terrible choices when faced with systems that punish truth-telling. Her testimony had helped secure convictions in cases that might otherwise have failed. Maria Chun had visited Evelyn once, 6 months earlier. It had been Maria's decision, made after years of therapy and processing. She'd wanted to see the woman who'd betrayed her niece, to try to understand in person what letters couldn't convey. They'd sat across from each other in the prison visiting room, two elderly women connected by tragedy and choice. Maria had expected to feel rage or satisfaction at Evelyn's diminished state. Instead, she'd felt a complicated sadness for everyone involved, for Sarah most of all, but also for Evelyn, for Morrison, for Patricia, for every person whose life had been warped by Henderson's crimes and the silence that protected him. "Why did you really call Shaw that night?" Maria had asked. "The truth." Evelyn had been quiet for a long time. Then, "Because I wanted someone else to stop her, so I wouldn't have to live with being the one who did. I wanted to believe I was protecting her by getting an authority figure involved. But I knew, deep down, I knew Shaw would silence her permanently, and I told myself I didn't know so I could live with myself. But I did know, and I made the call anyway. Was there any part of you that wanted to protect Sarah?" "All of me wanted to protect her," Evelyn had said, tears finally breaking through. "That's what makes it unforgivable. I loved that girl like I loved my own students, like I loved the person I'd been at her age. I wanted her to be safe and happy and successful. But when it came down to choosing between her safety and my own, between her truth and my comfort, I chose myself. And she died because of it." Maria had left that visit with no forgiveness to offer, but with a different kind of understanding. Evelyn wasn't a monster. She was a person who'd made a monstrous choice when tested. The distinction mattered, not because it excused anything, but because understanding how ordinary people committed extraordinary harm was essential to preventing it from happening again. Now, as summer faded into fall 2030, Maria worked on a book about Sarah's case and its aftermath. She'd been approached by multiple publishers, but she'd taken her time, wanting to tell the story completely and honestly. She wrote about Sarah's courage and the town's failure. She wrote about Evelyn's complicity and Morrison's cowardice. She wrote about the systems that protected predators and the difficult work of dismantling them. But she also wrote about hope, about Riverside's transformation, about the young people like Emma Rodriguez who'd grown up in a changed community and were carrying forward different values, about the cold cases that had been solved because investigators now believed victims and followed evidence wherever it led, about the lives saved because Riverside had chosen truth over comfort. The book would be published in 2031, titled The Price of Silence: Sarah Mitchell and the Fight for Justice. It would become required reading in criminal justice programs across the country, a case study in both failure and redemption. 10 years later, October 2034. The 10th anniversary of the case's resolution brought renewed media attention. Documentaries aired on major networks. Podcasts dissected every detail. Journalists returned to Riverside to see how the town had changed. What they found was a community that had matured into its transformation. The changes that had felt radical and uncomfortable in 2024 were now simply how Riverside operated. The police department's victim-centered approach wasn't controversial anymore. It was standard. The high school's comprehensive education programs weren't debated. They were celebrated as a model for other schools. Detective Sarah Chun, now Captain Chun heading the state's cold case division, gave a TED Talk that year about the case. She spoke to a packed auditorium about the importance of pursuing truth, even when it's buried under decades of silence. She spoke about believing victims even when it implicates people society wants to protect. And she spoke about Sarah Mitchell's enduring legacy. Sarah was 19 years old when she died, Chun said. Sarah's school photo displayed on the screen behind her. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was going to be a prosecutor, a voice for the voiceless. That was stolen from her by people who valued reputations over lives. But here's what they didn't understand. You can silence an individual, but you can't silence the truth forever. Sarah's questions didn't die with her. They echoed forward until someone was finally willing to listen. And now, those questions have transformed an entire community's approach to justice. Sarah Mitchell is gone, but her impact grows stronger every year. That's the thing about truth. It's patient. It waits. And eventually it wins. The talk went viral, viewed millions of times. It inspired a new generation of investigators, advocates, and activists. Sarah became a symbol, not just of victimization, but of the power of refusing to be silent even when silence seems safer. Evelyn Jackson died in December 2034, 3 months after her cancer diagnosis became terminal. She was 70 years old. She died in the prison infirmary with her sister and by her side, having lived 6 years in incarceration and 25 years before that in a prison of her own making. Her last words, according to and, were, "Tell Maria I'm sorry. Tell Sarah I'm sorry. Tell everyone I'm sorry," and held her hand as she died, weeping for the sister she'd loved and the choices that had destroyed her. Evelyn was buried in the Jackson family plot in Fort Wayne, her gravestone bearing just her name and dates. No platitudes about beloved teacher or cherished sister, just the stark facts of a life defined by its greatest failure. But in her personal effects, prison officials found notebooks filled with writing, letters she'd never sent, reflections on complicity and courage, analysis of how systems fail and how to build better ones. The notebooks were donated to the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, which used them in training programs for prosecutors and advocates, showing how even someone who'd committed terrible acts could eventually contribute to preventing future harm. 15 years later, spring 2039, Emma Rodriguez graduated from Indiana University Maurer School of Law in May 2039, having specialized in victim advocacy and criminal justice reform. She'd spent her law school years working with the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, helping solve cold cases and advocate for changes in how the justice system treated victims. At her graduation, Maria Chun, now 83 and frail but still sharp, attended along with Captain Sarah Chun and Emma's mother, Chief Angela Rodriguez. They represented different generations of women connected by Sarah Mitchell's story, each carrying forward her legacy in different ways. Emma's graduation speech focused on institutional accountability. "We can't prevent all harm," she said, "but we can build systems that take harm seriously when it happens. We can create cultures where victims are believed instead of blamed. We can hold powerful people accountable instead of protecting them." Sarah Mitchell tried to do this 30 years ago and paid with her life. Our job, my job, is to build the world where the next Sarah Mitchell lives to see her dreams realized. After graduation, Emma joined the prosecutor's office in Marion County, specifically requesting assignment to the cold case unit. Her first case involved a disappearance from 1997, a young woman named Christina Lopez who'd vanished under circumstances eerily similar to Jennifer Pratt's case. The investigation had gone cold because the primary suspect was a prominent businessman with political connections. Emma reopened it with Captain Chen's support. Using investigative techniques refined in the decades since Sarah's case, they built an airtight case. The businessman was convicted in 2040, sentenced to life in prison. Christina's family finally had answers after 43 years. "This is for Sarah," Emma said to Maria after the verdict. "For Christina. For everyone who was told their truth didn't matter." Maria, now using a walker but still attending every trial, nodded. "Sarah would be so proud of you," she said. "Of all of you." 20 years later, August 2044, the Riverside Community Center hosted a 20th anniversary commemoration of the case's resolution. The town square was filled with people, residents, visitors, advocates, survivors from across the state who'd been helped by programs Sarah's story had inspired. Emma Rodriguez, now a respected prosecutor with a reputation for dogged pursuit of justice in cold cases, spoke alongside Captain Chun, now retired but still active in advocacy work. They told Sarah's story to a new generation, teenagers who'd been born after the case was solved, but who lived in a Riverside transformed by its lessons. The Sarah Mitchell Memorial stood in the center of the square, bronze turning green with age. Fresh flowers were always placed at its base, by the foundation, by students, by people who'd never known Sarah but understood her importance. The inscription read, "Sarah Mitchell 1980 to 1999. She asked questions that needed asking, spoke truth that needed speaking, and changed a community by refusing to be silent." Among the crowd was a young woman named Isabel Shaw, 16 years old, great-niece of Martin Shaw. She'd grown up in the shadow of her great-uncle's crimes, carrying a name that in Riverside meant betrayal and murder. She'd been tormented by some classmates, defended by others, and ultimately had to forge her own identity separate from family legacy. Isabel had become an advocate for children of perpetrators, speaking about the unique trauma of inheriting shame for crimes you didn't commit. She'd started a support group at Riverside High, creating space for others whose families had been implicated in the case or similar situations. She spoke at the commemoration about the importance of accountability that didn't extend to punishing entire families. "My great-uncle did something unforgivable," Isabel said, her voice steady. "I can't change that, but I can choose who I want to be. I can choose to honor Sarah Mitchell's memory by standing for truth and justice. I can choose to break the cycles that made someone like my great-uncle possible. That's the work of my generation. Not just remembering what happened, but building something better in its wake." The crowd applauded. Emma Rodriguez, watching from the stage, felt tears on her cheeks. This willingness to face difficult truths, to transform pain into purpose, to refuse easy answers in favor of genuine change. This was Sarah's legacy. Not just in the laws that had been changed or the cases that had been solved, but in the hearts of people who'd chosen to do better. As the sun set over Riverside that evening, Maria Chun, 88 years old now, her time clearly short, stood before Sarah's memorial one last time. She touched the bronze face, still able to see her niece in the artist's rendering despite decades of fading memory. "We didn't forget you, sweetheart," Maria whispered. "We never forgot you. And the world is a little bit better because you were brave enough to ask those questions. Rest easy now. Your work is being carried forward." She turned to find Emma beside her, offering an arm for support. Together they walked back toward the crowd, toward the community Sarah had died trying to protect, now finally living up to the values she'd believed in. Behind them, the memorial caught the last rays of sunlight, Sarah's bronze face forever young, forever questioning, forever reminding Riverside that truth matters more than comfort, that justice delayed is not justice denied if people refuse to give up, and that one person's courage can echo through generations, transforming not just how we remember the past but how we build the future. In the quiet darkness that followed, if you listened closely, you could almost hear what Sarah had been trying to say all along. Believe us, protect us, hold perpetrators accountable, and never, ever choose silence over truth. Riverside was finally listening. Subscribe to our channel, where silence is never forgotten.